Biscuit had been part of my life for over a decade. He wasn't just a dog. He was a gentle, golden-furred soul who could make a crying child smile or calm a room full of anxious adults just by entering it. Certified as a therapy dog, he'd visited hospitals, nursing homes, and even my old high school during exam weeks. The neighborhood loved him. He was the unofficial mayor of our street. Every morning, kids on bikes would wave and shout his name. Delivery drivers brought extra treats just for him. Even old Mr. Jenkins, who hadn't smiled since 1994, gave Biscuit a slow nod when he passed. That dog had a gift, but none of that mattered to Karen. After that bizarre sidewalk ambush, I assumed Karen's warning was just her flexing HOA muscle. Maybe she needed a win for the week. But the next day, I got the letter. An official HOA notice, signed by President Karen herself, informing me that as of that month, large retrievers, pit bulls, Dobermans, and any animal over 40 pounds would no longer be permitted in shared community spaces, including sidewalks and lawns. Sidewalks. As if Biscuit had somehow weaponized his walk. It wasn't just petty, it was targeted, and everyone knew it. I appealed the decision immediately, submitting Biscuit's therapy papers, vaccination history, and even photos of him wearing a tiny graduation cap from his obedience training. The next board meeting was packed. Neighbors showed up with signs like, "We heart Biscuit," and "Retrievers are not terrorists." Karen sat at the head of the folding table like a queen in exile, lips pressed thin, tapping her pen like it was a gavel. I stood up and made my case. Calm, clear, and filled with every ounce of diplomacy I could muster. I even cracked a few jokes. People laughed. Karen didn't. When I finished, she cleared her throat and simply said, "Rules are rules. We're not debating this. No vote, no discussion." She stood, thanked everyone for their input, and left the room like the verdict had been pre-written. It had. After that, things escalated quickly. Karen took her war against Biscuit to the next level. She began walking the neighborhood with her phone out, recording Biscuit during our morning strolls. She filed 3 incident reports, claiming Biscuit was unleashed when he had been no more than 6 feet from me, trailing behind at a speed that would have been outrun by a toddler with a juice box. She posted signs near the community mailbox that read, "Please respect our pet policy. Some animals may be triggering or unsafe." At one point, I found a crudely photoshopped image of Biscuit growling, eyes red, teeth exaggerated, tacked to the HOA bulletin board with the caption, "Is this dog safe?" It looked like a horror movie poster for a film titled Retriever Rampage. The absurdity would have been funny if it hadn't been so clearly meant to isolate me. And yet, through all of it, Biscuit remained his usual patient self. He didn't understand why our walks got shorter, why the kids no longer stopped to pet him, or why I flinched every time Karen's voice rang out from across the street. He'd just look up at me with those wise old eyes and wait for the signal to keep going. He trusted me to make it better. That trust hit me like a punch in the chest. I realized then that this wasn't about rules. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't even about dogs. It was about control. Karen had decided she didn't like something, and because she had a title and a clipboard, she thought that gave her the right to erase it. But she underestimated one thing. I don't like bullies, and I sure as hell don't back down when you come after my dog. I hadn't decided exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Karen had just declared war. And in this war, I wasn't bringing signs or sympathy. I was bringing strategy. Karen didn't just win the battle. She celebrated like she'd conquered an empire. The morning after the HOA meeting, I found fresh new signs posted all around the neighborhood. They were printed on glossy paper, laminated, and zip-tied to everything that stood still long enough. Lampposts, community benches, even the entrance to the dog park, which now had a large banner reading, "Closed for maintenance, pet policy enforcement in effect." There wasn't a single maintenance worker in sight, of course. Just Karen, standing off to the side with her arms folded and a satisfied smirk stretching across her face like she'd just won an Oscar for best performance in a neighborhood meltdown. Neighbors started whispering. You could feel it, the unease in the air. Some people stopped walking their dogs altogether, worried they might end up on Karen's next blacklist. Parents whose kids used to toss tennis balls for biscuit began crossing the street when they saw us coming. Not out of malice, but fear. Karen had turned the community into a minefield of silent compliance, and I could tell people were waiting to see what would happen next. I tried to hold on to my patience. I really did. For the first few days, I adjusted our routine. Biscuit and I walked early in the morning, before the sun came up, and before Karen had time to stalk the sidewalk with her phone camera. We kept to the shadows, like fugitives in a suburban thriller. I clipped on his leash with the same care I might use to handle explosives, and kept one eye over my shoulder at all times. That's how it felt, like we were committing a crime by simply existing. But Karen wasn't content with quiet victories. No, she wanted control. Absolute control. So she kept escalating. She reported me to the HOA 3 times in 1 week, once for aggressive barking, even though Biscuit hadn't made a sound, once for trespassing, because his leash accidentally brushed the corner of her hedge, and once for what she called unauthorized interaction, which turned out to be Biscuit sitting calmly while a toddler reached out and gently patted his head. That toddler's mother later told me Karen had followed her home and lectured her for encouraging rule-breaking. The woman hasn't spoken to her since. I tried one last time to be civil. I walked across the street, looked Karen in the eye and said, "What do you want from me?" Her response, "Compliance." That word stuck in my head like a splinter. It wasn't about the dog. It never had been. Karen just wanted to prove she could bend the entire neighborhood to her will, that she could push someone, anyone, into submission. And when I didn't crumble immediately, she turned up the heat. I received a formal warning from the HOA, something about repeated violations, even though none of them held up under review. They were just noise, paper bullets meant to scare me. But what really broke me wasn't the paperwork or the isolation. It was the way Biscuit looked at the front door one afternoon and didn't move. He just sat there, staring, tail still, waiting, hoping for a walk that wouldn't come because Karen had made it impossible. I crouched down next to him, ran my fingers through his fur and whispered, "I'm sorry, buddy." And in that moment, something hardened in me. I had followed every rule, provided every document, spoken politely, respected boundaries, and all it earned me was silence from my neighbors and surveillance from a woman who thought power came with a nameplate and a mailing list. But I remembered something that Karen seemed to forget. There are 2 kinds of people in this world, the ones who demand control and the ones who find creative ways around it. So that night, I opened my laptop and started doing some research. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, out of necessity. I typed into the search bar, "Unusual pets allowed in HOA neighborhoods." What I found made me laugh. Then I laughed harder. Then I laughed so hard I had to sit back and wipe my eyes. There, buried in a legal forum, was a comment by some random guy in Tampa. HOA banned my dog, so I got a pet alpaca. They didn't see that coming. And that was the moment everything clicked. I wasn't just going to push back. I was going to push so far in the opposite direction that Karen would have no idea what hit her. I was going to out Karen the Queen of Karens herself. And I already knew exactly how. The plan was forming. The pieces were aligning. And Biscuit, still curled at my feet, lifted his head and gave me one slow tail wag. It was time to stop playing defense. Karen wanted compliance. She was about to get something entirely different. I don't know if you've ever tried to legally purchase a reptile the size of a loaf of bread, but let me tell you, it's easier than you think. And weirder. After hours of sifting through HOA bylaws, city ordinances, and some very sketchy pet forums, I confirmed what I needed to know. My HOA's rules, meticulously crafted by Karen and her clipboard brigade, never once mentioned reptiles. No ban on exotic pets. No clause about aquatic animals. Nothing about scales, fangs, or swamp origins. In fact, the word alligator didn't appear anywhere in the documentation. I double-checked, then triple-checked, just to be sure. So I made a call. The guy who answered the phone at the reptile breeder sounded entirely too calm about someone asking, "Do you sell alligators?" His name was Vic. Vic had a gravelly voice, the kind that sounds like he eats tree bark for breakfast, and a way of talking that made you believe he'd once arm-wrestled a Komodo dragon and won. He asked me a few basic questions, size, temperament, state laws, and then casually said, "Yeah, I've got a juvenile female. Real beauty. Eats raw chicken, about 2 feet long right now." I paused. "Does she bite?" Vic laughed like I'd just asked if the sky was sometimes blue. "Only if you're rude." That's when I knew she was perfect. The next weekend, I drove 2 hours to pick her up. She came in a heavy-duty plastic crate with air holes and a warning label that read, "Handle with respect." Inside was a tiny dinosaur with gold-speckled eyes and the calmest expression I've ever seen on a living creature. She blinked at me once, then yawned. I named her Karen. Bringing her home was a calculated move. I didn't parade her through the neighborhood. Not yet. First, I made sure everything was above board. I registered her as an exotic pet with the county, secured proper enclosure permits, and installed a custom-built habitat in my backyard, complete with a small pond, shaded area, and a motion-triggered misting system to keep her cool. Biscuit, upon first meeting her, tilted his head, sniffed, and then walked away like she was just another oversized frog. I took that as a good sign. Training Karen the alligator was easier than I expected. I'd read that juvenile gators are more docile, especially when handled early and consistently. So I spent time with her every day, feeding, talking, even walking her on a harness. Yes, they make those. It's bright pink with glittery rhinestones. If you're going to make a statement, go all in. The first walk around the block was everything I hoped for. I didn't announce it. I just stepped out onto the sidewalk like it was any other afternoon. Biscuit on my left, Gator Karen on my right, the leash gently swaying as she waddled beside me with surprising grace. The first person to see us was Mrs. Arnold from 2 houses down. She was watering her roses when she glanced up, froze, then slowly turned off the hose without breaking eye contact. "Is that?" she whispered. "Her name's Karen," I said cheerfully. "She's a rescue." Words spread like wildfire. By the end of the day, half the neighborhood had seen us. Some watched from behind curtains. Others pretended to check their mail just as we walked by. Kids pointed. A few brave souls asked questions. One guy actually fist-bumped me and said, "Respect." But the real show came the next morning. Karen, the original Karen, was in her front yard rearranging her lawn flamingos, or whatever it is petty tyrants do before sunrise. I stepped out, Biscuit and Gator Karen in tow, and began our usual route. I didn't say anything, just smiled. She turned, caught sight of us, and dropped her iced coffee. The cup hit the sidewalk with a pathetic plop, the lid rolling off as almond milk foam sprayed her sandals. She didn't speak, just stared. Jaw slightly unhinged, eyes locked on the gator in a glitter harness. I gave her a polite nod. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Then I kept walking. The neighborhood was buzzing by noon, People were calling it everything from the Pet Rebellion to Jurassic Bark. Memes started showing up in the community Facebook group. One had a photoshopped image of Biscuit riding Karen like a cowboy, captioned, "When the HOA bans your dog, so you get a dragon instead." I didn't make it, but I absolutely saved it. What made it better, what made it legendary, was that I wasn't breaking any rules. Not one. Karen couldn't report me, couldn't fine me, couldn't twist any bylaws, because I had done what she never expected. I played her game better than she could. And this was only the beginning. The moment Karen saw Karen was the moment everything in our quiet, HOA-ruled suburb shifted. It happened on a Wednesday mid-morning, when the sun was just starting to warm the sidewalks, and the birds hadn't yet realized their chirping was being drowned out by the sound of pure, silent shock. I had just clipped the pink glitter harness around my gator's middle and adjusted Biscuit's collar when I stepped outside. Karen, the neighbor, not the reptile, was standing at the edge of her driveway with a clipboard in one hand and a pair of pruning shears in the other. She was mid-lunge toward an innocent hydrangea when she caught sight of us. Her eyes traveled from Biscuit, who padded forward calmly, to the sparkling harness beside him. Then they landed on the thick, leathery tail sweeping rhythmically across the sidewalk. Her shears paused mid-air. Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again like a goldfish trying to remember how air works. I gave her a cheerful wave. "Morning, Karen." She blinked, eyes narrowing, as if trying to process the impossible. "Is that a joke?" "Oh, you mean Karen?" I asked, gesturing to the small alligator trotting confidently beside me. "No joke. She's quite affectionate once you get to know her. Biscuit likes her, don't you, buddy?" Biscuit gave a slow tail wag and sat down right in front of her lawn, the picture of calm defiance. Gator Karen, unfazed by the tension, let out a soft huff and nestled into a shady patch near the curb, completely content. It was an image of harmony, and it set real Karen on fire. She recovered quickly, of course. That's the thing about people like her. They never stay stunned for long. They recalibrate, then they reload. "I'll be contacting the HOA," she said through clenched teeth. "That thing is dangerous. It's a menace. It doesn't belong here." "You're absolutely right," I replied, nodding. "Which is why I went through all the proper channels. She's registered, licensed, and fully legal, unlike your impromptu ban on golden retrievers, which, by the way, had no precedent and no supporting incident reports." Karen stared at me like I'd just recited the devil's poetry. She tried again. "You can't seriously expect people to live next to a reptile." "Funny," I said. "That's exactly how I felt when someone started policing my dog." And then I walked on. Not fast, not dramatic. Just calmly, letting the leash sway and the sound of Gator Karen's little claws click across the pavement like some kind of applause. Real Karen didn't follow, but I could feel her eyes burning holes in the back of my head. The rest of the neighborhood was less alarmed than I expected. Surprised? Absolutely. But not angry. In fact, most people seemed downright amused. A few kids asked if they could pet her, to which I politely declined. Safety first. One dad gave me a thumbs up from across the street, mouthing the words "legend" as we passed. And the best part? No one complained. Because for the first time, Karen's reign of fear had been interrupted by something so absurd, so legally unassailable, that they couldn't help but root for the chaos. But Karen wasn't done. That afternoon, a special bulletin went out from the HOA. It was an emergency alert, thinly veiled as a community concern. The wording was vague but familiar. An exotic and potentially dangerous animal has been spotted on our streets. Residents are urged to exercise caution. It didn't mention me by name, but the message was clear. Karen had gone full scorched earth. So I responded the only way I knew how, with receipts. I uploaded a PDF of Karen's license, registration paperwork, enclosure specifications, and a signed veterinarian report declaring her healthy and low risk. I even included a paragraph titled, "Frequently Asked Questions," the first of which was, "No, she doesn't eat small children." That one got shared around the Facebook group more than I anticipated. Real Karen was livid. The next morning, she stood at the end of her driveway with her phone aimed at me like a weapon. As soon as I stepped outside with Biscuit and Gator Karen, she started recording. "This is the man bringing a dangerous predator into our neighborhood," she said in her best news anchor voice. "This is a threat to our safety." "Actually," I interrupted, "this is a 24-month-old female American alligator named Karen, registered under Florida Wildlife Code 68A-6.002. She weighs 14 pounds, and her diet consists of boneless chicken thighs and compliments." There was a beat of silence. Then, somewhere down the street, someone burst out laughing. Karen turned the camera away, furious. Later that evening, I hosted a small gathering in my front yard. Just a few chairs, some lemonade, and a modest turnout of curious neighbors who wanted to see the gator for themselves. I kept Karen behind her enclosure, of course, and made sure no one got too close. Biscuit lounged in the grass like a retired king, basking in the attention. And then, because life loves timing, the local news van pulled up. Apparently, someone, still a mystery, had tipped off a journalist. Within minutes, a reporter with perfect hair and a microphone was on my lawn, asking, "So what inspired you to adopt a pet alligator?" I looked straight into the camera and said, "When someone tries to tell you that your dog doesn't belong in your home, you have two options: back down or get creative. I chose creative. And Karen here? She's the most peaceful neighbor I've ever had." By the next morning, the story had gone viral. Karen tried everything after that. She called animal control. They checked my setup and found it pristine. She filed noise complaints. The HOA dismissed them for lack of merit. She even tried to claim emotional distress. But the board reminded her that emotional discomfort from someone else following the rules isn't a violation. It's a personal problem. And for the first time, Karen had no cards left to play. All she could do was watch as her name, the name she had plastered across rule books, memos, and warnings, was now being used to refer to a pink-harnessed gator who had more friends than she did. The HOA emergency meeting was called with a level of urgency usually reserved for natural disasters and tax audits. The email came through just before dinner, subject line screaming in all caps, "Mandatory HOA session, community safety concern." I could practically hear Karen typing it through gritted teeth. The meeting was scheduled for the next evening at the community clubhouse, and the whole neighborhood knew exactly what it was about. Word had already made its way around like gossip on rocket fuel. People weren't just curious. They were excited. This wasn't going to be a meeting. This was going to be a showdown. I arrived early, mostly to get a good seat and a better view. The room was already buzzing when I walked in. Foldable chairs lined up in nervous rows, neighbors whispering, smirking, trading cell phone videos of Karen the alligator walking calmly on a leash like the world's sassiest swamp princess. Biscuit sat beside me, tail thumping slowly, like he could sense the tension in the air. Karen, meanwhile, sat at the front of the room, flanked by two equally pinched board members who looked like they hadn't had a good time since the Nixon administration. Her clipboard was thicker than usual, and her smile tighter than a jar lid after an earthquake. She started speaking before the meeting was officially called to order. "This," she said, waving her arm as if she were gesturing toward a crime scene instead of a neighborhood gathering, "has gone too far. A wild animal is roaming our streets. Children are in danger. The sanctity of our community is being compromised by reckless behavior." There were some nods, but they were slow, hesitant. A few eyes darted to me, then to Biscuit, then to the calm Gator curled in a small carry enclosure at my feet. Karen continued. We cannot allow this precedent to stand. First an alligator, what's next? A tiger? A boa constrictor? An elephant? We need rules. We need order. The HOA president, a soft-spoken man named Frank, who had the perpetual expression of someone caught in a conversation he couldn't escape, cleared his throat and finally spoke. We appreciate your concerns, Karen, but we also have to follow existing bylaws and property rights. As of now, we've reviewed the situation and… Karen cut him off. I don't care what the paperwork says. This is a threat. I raised my hand. Frank looked relieved. Yes. Go ahead. I stood, slowly and calmly, as Biscuit rested his chin on my shoe, and Gator Karen blinked from her enclosure like a royal on tour. I'd like to respond if I may, not just to defend myself, but to clarify a few things. For everyone here. The room leaned forward just a little. I pulled out my folder and began laying down each piece of evidence like a blackjack dealer who knows the game is already won. Registration forms for Gator Karen. The Florida Wildlife Code, section highlighted. HOA bylaws, underlined and annotated. Photographs of Biscuit with therapy patients. Witness testimonies from neighbors. And for good measure, a copy of Karen's original memo banning certain dogs, with the word golden retriever, circled 3 times in red ink. Then I played a short video. It showed Karen at the previous HOA meeting, standing up and declaring my therapy dog a menace, while people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Then it cut to a clip of Biscuit laying on his back, belly up, while toddlers decorated him with flower crowns. The laughter in the room was low but unmistakable. I turned to the crowd. What's really going on here is not about dogs or alligators. It's about one person's need to control everyone around her, and what happens when that control is challenged. Karen shot to her feet. This is slander. You're all letting him make a mockery of this community. Frank sighed and turned to her. Karen, with all due respect, everything he's presented checks out. He's not violating any laws or HOA rules. And frankly, if the roles were reversed, I don't think we'd even be having this meeting. The room went quiet. Then Amir, a quiet board member who rarely spoke unless it was about landscaping or trash collection, raised his hand. Actually, he said, flipping through a printout, according to our bylaws, any member who imposes unauthorized restrictions, removes another resident's rights without proper voting procedure, or initiates false claims can be subject to fines and review. Karen turned to him, wide-eyed. What are you saying? I'm saying, Amir continued, that banning a neighbor's certified therapy dog, encouraging others to avoid him, and then launching a campaign of false HOA warnings, those are all violations. You're in breach, Karen. I could have sworn the air shifted. Karen's face paled, then flushed, then twisted into something that looked halfway between panic and rage. She tried to speak, but the board president raised a hand. We're issuing a formal fine, Frank said, and suspending your voting privileges for 6 months. Further incidents will result in a full review of your board position. Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. She sank back into her chair, her shoulders curling in, clipboard trembling in her lap. It was the first time in the history of this HOA that she hadn't had the last word. The meeting dissolved shortly after. People laughed, shook my hand, some even patted Biscuit on the head, like he'd personally negotiated peace in the Middle East. A few kids asked if Gator Karen would be getting a TikTok. One guy offered to design merch. Someone whispered Lawn King behind me as I left. Karen stayed behind, silent, staring at her clipboard like it had betrayed her. As I walked home, Biscuit trotting beside me and the gator safely nestled in her enclosure, I realized something had shifted beyond just the rules. The neighborhood had found its voice. The spell had been broken, and I hadn't raised it with anger or aggression. I'd done it with patience, paperwork, and just the right amount of petty brilliance. Karen had tried to ban my dog, but now she was the one who'd been muzzled, and we were just getting started. It started with one post, just a blurry photo taken by someone 2 streets over, captioned, "This man is walking an alligator named Karen, and I'm not even surprised anymore." By the time I saw it, it already had a few hundred likes, a few dozen shares, and a comment thread growing faster than my backyard tomatoes. Most of the replies were exactly what you'd expect. Laughing emojis, only in Florida, and one particularly poetic line. "You mess with the biscuit, you get the gator." It should have ended there. Just a local oddity. A weird neighborhood moment that made people smile for 10 seconds before scrolling on. But it didn't end there. The next post was a video. Someone, maybe one of the teens who lived near the park, had recorded me walking both Biscuit and Karen past the fountain on Main Street. It was a warm afternoon, and Karen had taken a liking to waddling in the shallow edge of the basin, tail swishing, while Biscuit sat patiently nearby, looking regal as ever. The caption read, "HOA banned his dog, so he got a pet alligator and named it Karen. Absolute icon." That video crossed 1 million views in less than 24 hours. By the following morning, I had interview requests from 5 news stations, 3 podcasts, and a YouTube prankster who asked if I'd be willing to dress Karen in a wedding dress for content. I politely declined that one. But I said yes to a local TV crew who came by with a van, a boom mic, and a reporter with perfectly shellacked hair who looked at Karen like she was a ticking bomb. They did a short segment, 5 minutes, but it ran during prime time. The anchor opened with, "Tonight, a story about one man's creative rebellion and the alligator who helped him do it." My name was said, my neighborhood shown, and Karen, real Karen, got a whole 2 seconds of blurred footage as she slammed her front door shut when the cameraman tried to get a quote. That's when things really took off. Reddit got a hold of it, then Twitter, then TikTok. Someone edited together clips from the news, the original HOA meeting, and photos of Biscuit with dramatic music and the words, "Florida Man Strikes Back, Gator Edition." That one got nearly 5 million likes. Memes followed. One showed Karen the alligator with laser eyes under the text, "She protect, she attack, but most of all, she get HOA Karen off your back." Another was a mock political poster. "Karen 2025, make swamps great again." I wasn't prepared for any of it. Suddenly, people were emailing me from other states. Some were thanking me. Others shared horror stories of their own HOA nightmares. Dogs banned for barking once, backyard swings removed for being too whimsical. Even one guy whose tomato plants were ripped out by a neighbor because they clashed with the lawn aesthetic. The messages came in waves. Stories, confessions, jokes. And through all of it, one sentiment kept repeating, "You did what I wish I could have done." It was surreal. Overnight, I had gone from that guy with the dog to that guy with the gator who stood up to the tyrant. I didn't plan it. I didn't even fully understand it. But the more I read, the more I realized people weren't just cheering for me. They were cheering for the principle behind the prank, for the quiet, satisfying revenge of someone who refused to back down. Even the merchandise started appearing without my input. T-shirts with Karen the Gator's face. Mugs that said, "Comply with this," under a cartoon of Biscuit in sunglasses. One Etsy seller made tiny plush versions of both pets and called them the HOA Resistance Duo. I bought one. I wasn't made of stone. Of course, all of this meant real Karen was trapped in a digital storm she couldn't control. For years, she'd wielded the rules like a sword, controlled the HOA meetings, controlled the narrative. But now, her name had become a punchline, a trending hashtag. Strangers were laughing at her powerlessness, her pettiness, and the irony that her downfall came wearing a pink glitter harness. The neighborhood changed too. People smiled more, said hello again. Some even knocked on my door with treats for Biscuit or little plush toys for Gator Karen. One family brought over a cake decorated with icing that said, "To the real MVPs, no leash too long, no rule too dumb." It was red velvet. We all had a slice on the porch. Then came the HOA newsletter. Every month, Karen had once used it to issue dry warnings about recycling schedules and paint color violations. This time, it had a new tone. It started with a letter from the interim board president, Frank, apologizing for any past overreach and promising more transparency going forward. There was even a new section titled Neighbor Spotlights. And guess who they picked first? There we were. Biscuit, Gator Karen, and me. A full-page photo of us sitting under the oak tree. Biscuit smiling, the gator napping, and me holding a lemonade. The caption read, "A community reclaimed." How one neighbor used humor, patience, and an unexpected pet to remind us what living together really means. Karen didn't show up to the next board meeting, or the one after that. I heard she started spending most of her time indoors, curtains drawn, only coming out to collect mail when she was sure no one was watching. I didn't take any joy in that. Okay, maybe a little. But mostly, I just felt relief. Not because she'd vanished, but because the fear had. The silence that used to follow in her wake, the tight tension every time someone wanted to question her authority. It was gone. In its place, there was laughter. Not cruel laughter, not mockery. Just the shared amusement of people who had spent too long pretending that being polite meant being quiet. And now, they had a story. A funny, ridiculous, strangely inspiring story. About a dog named Biscuit, a reptile named Karen, and a man who decided that the best way to fight absurdity was with more absurdity, properly licensed and well-trained. So yeah, the gator went viral. But what really went viral was hope. Hope that standing your ground didn't always mean shouting. That you could push back with a smile and a leash and a glitter harness. And that sometimes, just sometimes, the best way to say no is with a soft-spoken yes to something the rules never saw coming. The neighborhood was quieter than it had been in years. Not just in the way the birdsong echoed a little clearer in the mornings, or how the usual chorus of barking dogs had settled into something gentler, more rhythmic. It was a different kind of quiet, one that settled into the bones of the place. A calm that came not from silence, but from the absence of tension. The release of a pressure that had built up, quietly and steadily, under Karen's rule. And now, without her daily emails, sudden rule amendments, or clipboard patrols, the entire block seemed to breathe easier. Karen still lived there, of course, the real one. But you wouldn't know it unless you checked the tax records. Her once pristine lawn now had patches of overgrowth, as if even the grass had lost the will to cooperate. Her curtains stayed drawn most days, the blinds rarely tilted open. She no longer walked the neighborhood, no longer paused dramatically at other people's flower beds, or corrected the spacing of trash cans. It was as if her world had shrunk to the dimensions of her own property line. And for the first time, she was respecting the boundaries she had never before acknowledged. I didn't see her again for weeks. Meanwhile, life returned to something better than normal. Biscuit went back to his leisurely strolls, head high, tail sweeping with the easy grace of a dog who knew he was finally safe in his own home. Children came up to pet him again. Neighbors waved without hesitation. People lingered a little longer on their porches, talking and laughing, like they'd remembered what community actually felt like. Gator Karen enjoyed her usual routine, basking in the backyard sun, taking slow dips in her pond, occasionally startling the mailman in ways that were completely unintentional, but undeniably amusing. The HOA meetings changed too. The new leadership, people who had once sat silently at the edges of the room, now spoke with confidence. They focused on real issues: broken streetlights, potholes, overdue garden repairs. The conversations were thoughtful, respectful, productive. And though my name came up now and then, it was always in tones of appreciation, sometimes even admiration. I never tried to take credit. I just attended, offered input when needed, and let the rest speak for itself. One evening, about a month after everything had settled, I got a note in my mailbox. No signature, no return address. Just one sentence, typed and printed on plain white paper. Thank you for reminding me what courage looks like. I didn't know who it was from. Maybe one of the quieter residents, someone who had been on the receiving end of Karen's authority one too many times. Maybe someone who'd once been afraid to speak up. Either way, it said everything. The quiet after the storm wasn't just peaceful. It was healing. A collective exhale after years of walking on eggshells. The gator, the memes, the national spotlight. Those were all parts of the story, yes. But the real victory was this. The silence that came not from fear, but from peace. The kind that says, finally, we're free to live without being watched, judged, and ruled by someone else's need for control. That kind of quiet is loud in its own way, loud enough to be felt, and that's the sound our neighborhood carries now. Looking back, it's hard to believe all of it started with a dog. Not just any dog, of course. Biscuit, with his slow walk, soulful eyes, and a heart that could melt even the iciest stranger. And maybe that's what made it so offensive to someone like Karen. He was harmless, kind, well-loved. The sort of presence that doesn't demand attention, but earns respect quietly. In her world, that kind of calm was a threat. She couldn't control it, so she tried to erase it. And for a while, it almost worked. But here's the thing about boundaries. When someone pushes too far, when they trample over what's not theirs and then act like they're doing you a favor, you reach a point where enough becomes a promise. Not a threat, not a scream, just a line, calmly drawn, that says, no further. That line came in the form of a small, well-trained alligator with a glitter harness and a name that will go down in HOA history. I didn't fight fire with fire. I fought it with paperwork, humor, and patience. A slow burn, not an explosion. Because sometimes the best way to confront ridiculousness isn't with louder outrage, but with smarter strategy. You don't have to match someone's bitterness to stop it. You just have to make sure they can't pretend their behavior is normal anymore. What started as petty became powerful. What was meant as a punishment became a platform. And what was just supposed to be a message to one person turned into something bigger. A reminder that you're allowed to protect what's yours, even if it means getting creative. So if someone ever tries to erase what you love with a clipboard and a fake smile, remember, you have options. And maybe, just maybe, one of them involves a glitter-wearing gator named Karen.